The strangest inheritance Bruce Allpress may have left his children was not a mansion, not a secret fortune, not a glittering vault of awards, but a handful of unanswered questions lying like cold coins on a kitchen table after the funeral. For a man whose face had crossed New Zealand living rooms for decades, whose voice could fill a theater, and whose small role in a global fantasy epic made strangers point at him with affection, the silence around those final 96 hours feels almost indecent. The public records suggest he died peacefully at home, surrounded by his children. There should have been neat papers, clear explanations, a kind voice saying what happened, when it happened, and why. Instead, in the imagination of those who loved him, we see envelopes with soft edges, old photographs curling at the corners, a phone that no longer rings, and children left to wonder what was never written down. If the public had known then how many blank spaces might remain, the applause would have sounded different. Who benefits when an old actor's last days become a fog? Who decided that grief was enough of an answer? Or was the quiet simply the family's right to mourn without the world watching? Bruce Allpress was never the kind of star who seemed to live behind golden gates. That is what makes the mystery sharper. He belonged to the sort of fame that feels local, almost domestic, the fame of a familiar face appearing in the corner of the lounge while the kettle boils and the evening news waits its turn. People did not speak of him as an unreachable idol. They spoke of him as someone they had seen in a play, someone their parents remembered from television, someone who turned up in a scene and made it feel lived in. And yet, familiarity can be a disguise. A nation can think it knows a man because it has watched him laugh on screen, because it has heard him deliver lines in a warm, rough, unmistakably human voice. But a screen life is not a home life. A theater program is not a family record. A film credit is not a medical timeline. When the curtain falls, the most basic facts can become strangely difficult to collect. This is where the social contrast begins to bite. On one side, there is Bruce under the lights, the seasoned performer, the veteran whose career stretched through radio, television, theater, and film. On the other side, there is the private man, older, quieter, living with the ordinary vulnerabilities that fame does not protect anyone from. The public saw the glow. Families often inherit the shadows. He had known the crowded warmth of New Zealand entertainment long before the world learned his face through a brief but unforgettable appearance in the great fantasy saga filmed on home soil. Before that, he had already done the hard miles. He had worked in radio, acted on stage, appeared in local television productions, and become one of those dependable professionals who make a national industry feel possible. He was not manufactured by publicity. He was built by work. That kind of career produces admiration, but not always riches. Here is the cruel trick of show business, especially in a small country. A face can be known everywhere, while the bank account tells a more modest story. An actor can be beloved by taxi drivers, nurses, teachers, and retirees, yet still spend much of his life moving from contract to contract, audition to audition, project to project, with applause replacing security more often than anyone likes to admit. So when people hear the word inheritance, they imagine money first. They imagine royalties, overseas checks, perhaps some hidden reward from appearing in a film that made the world tremble with excitement. But the truth of acting is often less glamorous. A performance can be immortal, while the payment for it was painfully ordinary. A scene can live forever, while the performer went home with a fee that paid bills, not dynasties. That is why the question of legacy around Bruce Allpress feels so raw. It is not simply about what was left in accounts or boxes. It is about whether the children of a respected man were given the dignity of clarity. It is about whether the story of his last stretch was carefully held. or allowed to drift into half-sentences and polite avoidance. There are families who know this particular pain. After the service, after the casseroles, after the sympathy cards have stopped arriving, comes the paperwork. There are passwords nobody wrote down, appointments nobody remembers, names of people who said they would explain everything, and then never quite do. Grief turns into administration. Love turns into phone calls. A child becomes an investigator, not because they want scandal, but because they cannot rest without a sequence of facts. With Bruce, the public record gives us the outline of a life. Born in New Zealand, shaped by performance, cherished by audiences, remembered for roles that ranged from local productions to a place in one of cinema's most famous worlds. But an outline is not a final chapter. It does not tell us who was in the room, who made the calls, which concerns were raised, which reassurances were given, and what his children were told after everything had already become irreversible. And this is the uncomfortable part. No one needs to accuse anyone of wickedness for the unease to grow. Sometimes the villain in a family story is not a person with a sharp smile and a hidden ledger. Sometimes the villain is the silence itself, sitting at the table like an invited guest, nodding politely while everyone avoids the one question that matters. But silence rarely arrives alone. It is usually carried by people who think they are protecting someone, preserving privacy, keeping things tidy, avoiding distress. A manager, a friend, a neighbor, a medical voice, a relative, a well-meaning intermediary. They may begin as the only support in the room, the one calm figure holding a folder, answering the phone, offering to handle the difficult details. Yet even kindness can cast a shadow when it becomes the gate through which every fact must pass. That, as the old saying goes, is the snake on the breast in stories like this. Not a named villain, not a proven betrayer, but the comforting figure who says, "Leave it with me." The person who seems indispensable when the family is shocked and exhausted. The person who knows where the papers are, who spoke to whom, who heard what, and who later remembers less than expected. Imagine the room after the funeral. Cups with tea gone cold, flowers beginning to brown at the edges, a program from the service lying beside an old publicity photograph. A family member asks a practical question, perhaps about the last appointment, perhaps about a call that was made, perhaps about what Bruce himself understood in those final days. The answer comes back soft, vague, almost apologetic. "We are not sure. It was all very quick. Someone else would know." Those phrases sound harmless. They are often spoken by decent people. But to a child who has just lost a father, they can feel like doors closing one by one. Not sure. Very quick. Someone else. Each phrase removes a plank from the bridge back to the truth. Bruce's career had always been built on presence. He could step into a scene and make it solid. On television, he carried the weathered authority of a man who knew life from the ground up. On stage, he had the discipline of someone trained by repetition, not vanity. In the fantasy epic where many viewers now remember him, his role was brief, but fans noticed him because good actors make even a small moment feel inhabited. That is the heartbreaking contrast. A performer who gave audiences the feeling of certainty may have left his own children with uncertainty. A man who delivered lines written for him with clarity may have entered his final stretch surrounded by lines nobody wanted to say out loud. The public inherited the image. The family may have inherited the blanks. And blanks have weight. They do not sit quietly. They grow in the mind at night. They attach themselves to ordinary objects, a coat still hanging near the door, a pair of glasses, a note in familiar handwriting, a calendar square with something crossed out. The absence of explanation becomes its own form of noise. There is also the matter of dignity. Older actors often live between reverence and neglect. They are celebrated when nostalgia is useful, invited to reunions, praised in obituaries, remembered in glowing phrases. But in the practical machinery of life, they can become fragile citizens like anyone else, dependent on systems, schedules, and the honesty of those around them. Applause cannot demand records. Fame cannot force a proper conversation. For Bruce Allpress, whose appeal rested partly on being solid, approachable, and unpretentious, that possibility feels especially painful. He was not a scandal machine. He was not known as a reckless tabloid creature crashing through nightclubs and courtrooms. His power was steadier. That is why the questions around his last days, even framed only as rumor and emotional gaps, feel like a violation of the man audiences thought they understood. The missing inheritance, then, is not only money. It is sequence. It is context. It is the right of children to know whether their father's final days unfolded as they were later told, or whether the story was rounded off for public consumption before the family had even found its footing. It is the difference between mourning and wondering. And if you think wondering is harmless, ask anyone who has had to reconstruct a loved one's last week from receipts, messages, and memories borrowed from people who were only partly there. They will tell you that uncertainty becomes a second bereavement. It is quieter than the first, but it lasts longer. So the first question is not whether Bruce Allpress was secretly rich, or whether some melodramatic fortune vanished into the night. That would be too easy, too cheap, too false to the texture of his life. The real question is harsher and more intimate. If the public received a polished remembrance of a respected actor, did his children receive the full, plain map of what happened before that remembrance was written? And if the most valuable inheritance was the truth, then who, after the flowers faded, was still holding a piece of it back? Someone came to the edge of Bruce Allpress's final story, carrying information. And the troubling part is that no one outside the tightest circle can say exactly how much that person knew. Picture a hallway light left on in an ordinary New Zealand home, the low murmur of a conversation behind a half-closed door, a notebook open beside a phone, and an older actor listening more quietly than usual. If the details of that encounter had been fully understood at the time, perhaps the family would not have had to ask so many questions later. Was it a visitor? A call? A professional check-in? A friend dropping by with concern? Or simply one of those brief exchanges that becomes enormous only after tragedy has given it a new shadow? We are not here to invent a culprit. We are here to ask why one of the most important stretches in a beloved man's life can still feel as though someone turned down the lights before the scene was finished. There is a pattern in the lives of veteran performers. Their public selves remain bright long after their private routines have narrowed. The audience remembers the roar of a theater, the clatter of applause, the old interviews where stories spill out easily and the actor seems indestructible. But families see the calendar on the fridge, the appointments, the fatigue carefully dismissed, the stubborn insistence that everything is fine. Bruce had spent decades learning how to keep going. That is what working actors do. They do not wait for perfect conditions. They work through uncertainty, through rejection, through tiredness, through the indignity of being recognized one day and overlooked the next. In a small entertainment world, professionalism becomes armor. You show up, you say the line, you do not make a fuss. That armor may have served him beautifully on set, but armor can be dangerous in old age. It can teach a man to understate discomfort. It can train friends to believe him when he waves away concern. It can make family members wonder later whether they missed signals because he had spent a lifetime making strain look manageable. Here the ticking clock begins to sound. Not loudly, not like a cinematic countdown with red digits and alarms. More like an old wall clock in a quiet room, each second carrying the terrible possibility that a conversation should have happened sooner. In stories of final days, the most haunting words are often simple ones. If only someone had asked again. No public record, at least none widely available, gives outsiders a complete hour-by-hour account of Bruce's last 96 hours. That absence is not proof of wrongdoing, but absence is exactly what unsettles people. The gap invites imagination, and imagination is merciless when grief is involved. A final stretch can contain many ordinary things: a phone call, a meal barely touched, a decision to rest, a reassurance, a plan postponed, a name mentioned in passing. Later, each ordinary thing becomes evidence in the private court of family memory. Who called? Who did not call? Who noticed the change in his voice? Who thought it was nothing? This is where the idea of a secret visitor becomes less about a dramatic stranger in a dark coat and more about access. In the last days of an older public figure, access is everything. Who could reach him directly? Who could interpret his mood? Who could tell the family that all was well, or that things were worse than they appeared? The person with access does not need to be sinister to become central. For years, Bruce had been surrounded by the casual intimacy of show business. Actors, crew members, producers, theater people, local admirers, old colleagues. That world can feel like family, and sometimes it is, but it can also blur boundaries. People who know the performer may not know the father. People who know the public anecdote may not know the private fear. Imagine a colleague remembering him as cheerful because they saw him smile. Imagine a neighbor remembering him as quiet because they passed him near the letterbox. Imagine a professional voice remembering only the formal details because that is all the form required. Each witness holds a fragment, and each fragment may be true, but fragments do not become a picture unless someone has the patience and the authority to place them together. That, according to the emotional force behind this story, is what his children may have been left to do. Not chase scandal for the sake of it, not accuse without evidence, simply piece together the last known movements of a father whose public life had been archived better than his final private hours. There is something almost cruel about that. A television appearance from decades earlier can survive online, labeled and dated. A film role can be indexed in databases, repeated by fans, preserved with obsessive care. But a father's last meaningful conversation can vanish into conflicting recollections within days. The world can remember the costume, while the family struggles to recover the voice. Bruce's later recognition through international cinema created another layer of contrast. To global fans, he was part of a mythic landscape of battles, courage, and farewell. To New Zealand viewers, he was also part of a more domestic memory, the steady actor who had been there through changing decades. But to his children, he was not a symbol. He was Dad. And symbols are easier to manage than fathers. The public farewell to a respected actor tends to smooth everything. Obituaries choose elegant lines. Tributes highlight generosity, craft, humor, and longevity. These things may all be true. They may be deeply deserved. But they can also create a velvet curtain over the messier aftermath, where families must ask questions that sound almost rude after everyone else has decided the story is beautiful. What happened in the final days? Who explained the sequence? Were concerns raised early enough? Were the children told directly, or did they hear pieces from different mouths? Did anyone keep notes? Did anyone assume someone else had already called? The more ordinary the questions, the more disturbing they become. Because no grand conspiracy is required for a family to be left in the dark. It can happen through delay, embarrassment, privacy rules, misplaced papers, human discomfort, or the old habit of protecting the elderly from worry while accidentally excluding those who most need to know. Still, every family has its unofficial record keeper, the one who remembers birthdays, medical appointments, old grudges, unpaid debts, favorite meals, names of doctors, and the way someone sounded on the telephone. If that person is present, the story can be anchored. If that person is missing, or silent, or too shattered to speak, the story drifts. In Bruce's case, the public does not know who held that role at the end. That is precisely the point. The absence of a clear narrator leaves room for speculation. The trusted figure, the calm helper, the one who might have known more, becomes a shape behind frosted glass. Viewers lean closer and ask, was there someone who could have explained everything, but did not? It must be said plainly, there is no verified public evidence of a malicious hidden visitor altering the course of Bruce Allpress's final days. Those who knew him described a peaceful end at home. But there is a powerful dramatic question around the final 96 hours, because the emotional record feels incomplete. When a family's grief meets incomplete information, suspicion does not need proof to begin breathing. This is the kind of suspicion older audiences understand. They have seen relatives shielded from facts, estates muddled, hospital conversations forgotten, family members told too late, and important decisions reduced to phrases like, "It was for the best." They know how quickly a life can be tidied away by people who are not the ones who must live with the questions. Bruce's image makes the unease sharper because he represented steadiness. He did not seem like a man surrounded by chaos. He seemed like the kind of performer who would arrive on time, learn the work, treat others decently, and go home without demanding worship. When such a man's final stretch becomes clouded by missing context, the mind rebels. Surely someone wrote it down. Surely someone told the children. Surely there was no confusion. But surely is not evidence. It is a comfort word. Families discover this too late. The fatal encounter in this story may not have been a single dramatic meeting. It may have been a chain of small meetings, each one insufficient. A brief visit that noticed too little. A call that reassured too quickly. A conversation that should have triggered urgency, but instead dissolved into politeness. A promise to update the family that became delayed by hours, then swallowed by events. That is how tragedy often enters respectable homes. Not through a smashed door, but through hesitation. Not through a villain laughing in the shadows, but through people assuming there will be time tomorrow to clarify what feels uncomfortable today. And somewhere inside that possibility is the image that will not leave us. Bruce, an old professional who had spent his life understanding cues, perhaps surrounded in his final days by people who missed the most important cues of all. The actor who knew when to speak and when to wait may have been waiting for someone else to say the plain thing. Or perhaps he said it, and the record of it never reached the people who needed it most. So when we speak of a secret visitor, we are really speaking of the unknown witness, the person or people who saw the last changes before the family had the full picture. The figure whose memory might explain why the final 96 hours feel too smooth in public and too jagged in private. The one who could turn fog into sequence. And if such a person existed, if someone did see the signs, hear the concern, receive the call, or understand the urgency before the children did, then why did the clearest explanation seem to arrive only after silence had already taken control? The deepest betrayal in an actor's life is not always a stolen role, a bad contract, or a critic's cruel sentence. Sometimes, it is the quiet decision of someone close to tell only the convenient part of the truth. Think of a drawer closed too quickly, a message not forwarded, a family member standing beside the phone with tired eyes, waiting for an answer that keeps coming back, softened and incomplete. If the whole story of Bruce Allpress's final stretch was known by even one person before it was known by his children, then the wound is not merely grief, it is exclusion. What was filtered? What was delayed? What was considered too upsetting, too private, too complicated, until it became impossible to ask without sounding accusatory? The fear is not that a monster was hiding in the room. The fear is that ordinary loyalty may have been used as a curtain. In public, betrayal has a theatrical shape. We imagine a friend selling secrets, a manager pocketing money, a lover whispering to journalists. But in real families, betrayal often wears slippers. It brings tea. It says everyone is doing their best. It tells the children not to worry before it has earned the right to say so. This is the dangerous softness at the center of Bruce's story. The people around an elderly public figure may sincerely believe they are protecting dignity. They may avoid details because the man was private. They may keep the tone gentle because the family is grieving. Yet protection can become control when information passes through too few hands. For the children of any admired performer, there is already a strange competition for ownership. Fans feel they knew him. Colleagues feel they shared the real working man. Interviewers preserve his anecdotes. Producers preserve his credits. Archives preserve his image. But children preserve something more fragile: the right to ask what happened when the audience was gone. Bruce Allpress' career gave many people a piece of him. That is the bargain performers make with the world. They lend their faces to strangers. They become part of other people's memories. They are greeted in supermarkets by people who remember a role better than the actor remembers the day it was filmed. But no role, however loved, should outrank the family's need for truth. A fan may want a beautiful ending. A child needs an honest one. This is where the social contrast returns with a sharper edge. On screen, Bruce could be placed within grand stories, stories of courage, danger, and fate. In real life, his last chapter may have depended on the small bureaucracy of aging. Appointments, messages, instructions, health updates, family contact, personal wishes. The epic and the ordinary collided, and the ordinary may have won. For many older performers, money is not the only vulnerability. Information is. Who controls the diary? Who has the phone numbers? Who understands the paperwork? Who knows which adult child should be contacted first? Who decides whether a change is serious enough to disturb the family? These questions sound administrative, but they are emotionally explosive. Because after the funeral, every administrative decision becomes moral. A delayed call becomes a possible betrayal. A missing note becomes a possible concealment. A vague explanation becomes a possible insult to the love between parent and child. There is no evidence that Bruce Allpress was deliberately kept from his children. The public record does not support such a claim, and it must be treated as an open question, not a conclusion. But the subject of this film is not a courtroom verdict. It is the aching suspicion that children may have had to assemble their father's final days from pieces that should have been handed to them whole. Anyone who has handled an estate, even a modest one, knows the cold intimacy of it. You open drawers. You find receipts, old letters, reading glasses, perhaps an address book written in a hand that suddenly feels unbearably alive. You learn which bills were paid and which subscriptions continued after the person was gone. You discover that a life can be reduced by institutions to forms and reference numbers, even while your chest is still broken. Now imagine doing that while also wondering whether you have the real timeline. Not the public timeline, not the polite version, the real one. The final calls, the final concerns, the final decisions made by others in rooms where you were not present. That is why the phrase, "after the funeral," matters. Before the funeral, shock can numb a family. During the funeral, ceremony gives grief a shape. After the funeral, the house goes quiet, and questions that were too painful to ask begin knocking from the inside. They do not ask permission. They arrive while washing a cup, while sorting papers, while hearing an old recording of his voice. For Bruce's children, the legacy may have included pride, stories, affection, perhaps private memories no fan will ever touch. But pride does not cancel confusion. Love does not erase the need for detail, and a father's public dignity should not become a reason to leave his family with less than the full account. The possible betrayal of someone close, then, is not necessarily a sale of secrets or a grab for money. It could be the betrayal of assuming that children are too fragile for facts. It could be the betrayal of tidying the narrative before the family had examined it. It could be the betrayal of placing reputation, privacy, or convenience above clarity. In the entertainment world, reputation is a currency. Even beloved older actors are often wrapped in phrases that protect the brand of memory. He was loved. He passed peacefully. He had a wonderful career. He will be missed. These phrases may be true, but they can also flatten the rough ground beneath them. They can make it harder to ask whether everything that should have been done, said, documented, and explained actually was. The public tends to prefer clean endings. It is uncomfortable to imagine a respected actor's children making calls after the service, trying to learn who knew what and when. It disturbs the sentimental picture. It turns a warm obituary into a cold file. But the cold file is part of the truth too. Every beloved figure leaves one. Not always a scandalous file, not always a shameful one, but a bundle of facts that determine whether those left behind can sleep. When that bundle is incomplete, imagination supplies the missing pages, and imagination is rarely merciful. There is another layer here, and it is perhaps the most painful. Bruce came from a generation that often carried hardship quietly. Men of that era were not always trained to narrate vulnerability. They could be loving and still private, expressive on stage and guarded at home, capable of moving an audience while refusing to trouble their children with fear. If he withheld worry, it may have been habit, pride, or tenderness. But if others then withheld context, the children were left with a double silence. A father's silence is hard enough. A circle's silence is worse. The public will ask why any of this matters if there is no dramatic accusation. It matters because legacy is not only what the newspapers print. Legacy is the story a family must carry for the rest of its life. If that story has holes, the holes become heirlooms. We must also remember the strange cruelty of fame in a small nation. Everyone knows someone who knows someone. Rumors travel softly. A half-remembered detail from a friend of a friend can reach a family long after official sympathy has ended. That is when children may hear a version they were never told directly. That is when grief turns hot. Perhaps there were perfectly ordinary explanations for every gap. Perhaps the final days were handled with care, and the questions exist only because private grief can never be fully satisfied. That is possible. It must be allowed. But if that is so, why does the story still lend itself so powerfully to the feeling of missing context? Because the emotional facts remain. A respected actor. A final 96 hours. Children. Silence after the funeral. Too many blank spots for comfort. No single villain needed, only the uneasy sense that a family deserved more than fragments. And in the end, Betrayal is sometimes measured not by what was done, but by what was never explained. The person closest to the facts may never have intended harm. The people around Bruce may have been grieving too, confused too, overwhelmed too. But intention does not fill a blank space. Only truth can do that. So we return to the image of the closed drawer, the quiet phone, the old photograph. The children trying to understand the last movement of a life that had meant so much to strangers and infinitely more to them. We return to the terrible possibility that the public farewell came wrapped in warmth, while the private aftermath came wrapped in questions. We return to the thought that somewhere, someone may have known enough to make the story clearer. And if the clearest truth about Bruce Allpress's final days was available to someone close, why were his children left, even possibly, to search for it after the world had already said goodbye? There are people who carry a small object through their entire working life, not as decoration, not as vanity, but as a private anchor between themselves and the world they cannot fully control. Those who worked alongside Bruce Allpress in the long middle years of his career sometimes noticed a particular habit of his: a pause before stepping into a scene, a quiet moment of stillness that looked like concentration, but felt to those who watched closely like something more personal. Whether it was a ritual, a superstition, or simply the discipline of a man who had learned to center himself before the lights came on, the people around him respected it without asking questions. That is the code of working actors. You do not interrupt the private preparation. You do not ask what the stillness means. But when a man's private rituals disappear from the record along with everything else about his final days, the stillness he carried through a lifetime begins to feel like a clue that nobody thought to preserve. What did Bruce hold on to in the quiet before the curtain? And who, if anyone, was paying attention when that quiet became permanent? He had come up through the kind of training that does not produce celebrities. It produces craftsmen. New Zealand in the middle decades of the 20th century was not a place where an actor could expect to be carried by glamour. The industry was small, the budgets were modest, and the work demanded versatility above all else. Radio came first for many performers of his generation, and radio is a discipline that strips away everything except the voice and the imagination behind it. You cannot rely on a costume, a set, a gesture, or a look. You have only the breath and the word, and the listener's willingness to follow you into a world that exists nowhere except in sound. Bruce understood that world. He moved through it with the patience of someone who had decided early that the work itself was the reward, not the recognition. Radio gave him range. It asked him to be old men and young men, villains and heroes, comic figures and tragic ones, sometimes within the same broadcast week. That kind of range does not come from talent alone. It comes from listening, from watching, from the habit of noticing how people actually speak when they are frightened or tired or trying to hide something. That habit of noticing would serve him for decades. It would carry him from radio into theater, from theater into television, and eventually into the kind of film work that placed his face in front of audiences who had never heard of New Zealand's domestic entertainment history, but who would remember him anyway, because a good actor makes even a small moment feel inhabited. The theater years were formative in a way that television never quite replaces. Stage work demands a different kind of courage. There is no second take, no editor to rescue a stumble, no close-up to compensate for a missed beat. The audience is present and breathing, and they know, even if they cannot articulate it, when a performer is genuinely inside the scene, and when they are merely executing it. Bruce was the kind of actor who was genuinely inside. Colleagues from those years described a man who prepared thoroughly, who did not waste rehearsal time, who listened to other actors rather than simply waiting for his own lines to arrive. That reputation for reliability is worth pausing on. In a small industry, reliability is not a minor virtue. It is the difference between a career and a series of near misses. Directors remember who shows up prepared. Producers remember who does not create problems. Casting decisions in a tight professional community are made partly on the basis of who can be trusted to deliver without drama. Bruce built that trust over years, and it became the foundation of a career that outlasted many of his contemporaries. But reliability can also become invisibility. The actor who never causes trouble is sometimes the last one to be celebrated. The performer who does the work without demanding attention can find that the attention goes elsewhere, to the louder, the more difficult, the more spectacular. This is one of the quiet injustices of show business, and that is felt most sharply by those who gave the most steadily. For Bruce, the television years brought a different kind of recognition. New Zealand audiences saw him in their living rooms, in the domestic light of evening, and that intimacy created a bond that theater could not quite replicate. He became part of the furniture of national memory in the best possible sense. Not a monument, but a presence. The kind of face that makes a scene feel real because it belongs to someone who seems to have actually lived. And yet, the economics of that recognition were never straightforward. Here is the contrast that matters. A face known in every household does not automatically translate into financial security. In a small television market, fees were modest. Residuals were not always structured to protect performers across decades. An actor could appear in dozens of productions, be recognized everywhere he went, and still find that the practical arithmetic of a working life left little margin. This is not a complaint unique to Bruce. It is the condition of most working actors in most small markets. But it matters to the story of his legacy because it shapes what his children may have inherited. Not a vault of royalties, not a portfolio of investments built on international fame. More likely, the modest accumulation of a professional life lived honestly, with the gaps and uncertainties that come from decades of contract work rather than salaried security. When the great fantasy saga came to New Zealand to film, it brought with it a scale of production that the local industry had never seen. The logistics alone were staggering. Thousands of crew members, years of shooting, landscapes transformed into mythic territories, and a cast that blended international names with local talent. For the New Zealand actors who were cast, even in smaller roles, it was an encounter with a different order of filmmaking entirely. Bruce's role was not large, but it was noticed. Fans of the saga are meticulous observers, and they recognized in his brief appearance the quality that had defined his career. The sense that the person on screen had a life beyond the frame. That is not a small thing. Many actors with larger roles in larger productions fail to create that impression. He created it in a handful of scenes, and it was enough to introduce him to a global audience that would carry his face into the digital age. The irony is that this late international recognition arrived at a point in his life when the practical benefits of fame were harder to convert into security. Older actors do not always receive the same commercial opportunities that younger ones do. The recognition may be warm, but the phone does not ring with the same frequency. The world remembers you fondly and moves on to the next generation, and you are left with the affection of strangers and the quiet of a house that used to be busier. That quiet is where the story of his final years begins to matter most. Not the public quiet of a respected career winding down gracefully, but the private quiet of an older man navigating the ordinary vulnerabilities that fame cannot protect anyone from. Health decisions, practical arrangements, the slow reorganization of daily life around what is possible rather than what was once easy. For his children, this period may have been both familiar and opaque. Familiar because they knew their father, knew his habits, knew the way he carried himself through difficulty. Opaque because older parents often protect their children from the full weight of their concerns, and performers especially can be skilled at presenting a composed face to the people they love most. So the question of what was known, and when, and by whom, begins here. Not in the final 96 hours, but in the months and years before them. Who was monitoring the changes? Who was receiving the honest account rather than the reassuring one? Who had the full picture, and who had only the version Bruce chose to offer? And does anyone who is present in those quieter years still hold information that his children have never been given directly? There is a particular kind of person who appears in the lives of older public figures, and they are rarely the dramatic villain of a thriller. They are more often simply the person who is there. The neighbor who checks in regularly, the old colleague who still calls, the professional contact who handles a specific practical matter and gradually becomes a point of contact for other things too. They accumulate access not through scheming, but through availability. They are present when others are busy or distant or simply unaware that presence is needed. In the world Bruce had inhabited for decades, such figures were common. Show business creates long, informal loyalties. People who worked together on a production 30 years ago can still feel a bond that has no formal name. They are not family, but they are not strangers either. They occupy a middle territory that can be enormously valuable in old age, and occasionally enormously complicated. Those who knew Bruce in the New Zealand theatre community described a man who maintained long friendships with professional warmth but personal reserve. He was generous with his time in professional contexts, willing to support younger actors, willing to appear at events that celebrated the industry he had served. But he was also described as someone who kept his private life genuinely private, not as a performance of mystery, but as a genuine preference for separating the public self from the domestic one. That separation, admirable in a performer, can create complications in a crisis. If the people who knew him best professionally did not know him well domestically, and if the people who knew him domestically were not always present in his professional world, then the final stretch of his life may have been witnessed by people who each held only a partial view. A partial view is not a lie, but it can produce an incomplete account. And an incomplete account, passed to a grieving family in the days after a loss, can feel like a locked room. Imagine the phone calls that may have followed. A child reaching out to someone who knew Bruce in a professional capacity, asking for a sense of how he had seemed in recent months. The answer comes back warm, general, reassuring. He seemed well. He was in good spirits. We spoke not long ago, and he was his usual self. These answers are not necessarily false, but they may not be the answers the child most needed. They may be the answers of someone who saw the public face, not the private one. And if the private face told a different story, who was responsible for making sure that story reached the people who had the most right to hear it? This is the question that does not go away. Not because there is evidence of deliberate concealment, but because the structure of an older performer's social world can create gaps between what is known and what is communicated, and those gaps can widen very quickly when time runs out. The final weeks, then, are not only a medical question, they are a social one. Who was in contact? Who communicated with the family, and how completely? Who assumed that someone else had already made the important call? Who waited for a better moment that did not arrive? These are the questions that haunt families long after the formal condolences have ended. They are not accusations. They are the natural consequence of a life that was lived partly in public and partly in private, with different people holding different pieces of the whole. And if even one of those pieces was never passed to his children, then the inheritance they received was incomplete. Not through malice, perhaps, but incomplete nonetheless. What would it take, do you think, for the full picture of those final days to finally reach the people who most deserve it? There is a house in the memory of every working actor's family. Not always a grand one, not always the house where the famous scenes were filmed or the awards were received, but the house where the ordinary life happened. The house where the scripts were read at the kitchen table, where the lines were rehearsed in the hallway, where the costume was hung on the back of a door and the performance was left outside. That house holds a different kind of archive than any film database or theater program. It holds the record of who the person actually was when the work was done and the door was closed. For Bruce Allpress, that domestic archive is not available to the public, nor should it be. But it is the archive that matters most to the people who grew up inside it, and it is the archive that becomes most urgently important when the person at its center is gone. Those researching this period have spoken with people who were present in Bruce's later years, including, according to one anonymous account, someone who drove him to appointments. And what emerges is a portrait of a man who was thoughtful and still paying attention. Not talkative, not performative, but present. He would sometimes comment on the city as they drove through it, on buildings that had changed, on streets that had been there since his early career. He seemed, according to this account, to be a man who was aware of time passing without being defeated by it. That detail is small, but small details are often the most honest ones. A man who notices the city changing around him is a man who is still paying attention. A man who is still paying attention is a man who may have had more to say about his own situation than those around him realized. Did he say it? Did he say it to the right people? Did the right people pass it on? The driver remembered one particular journey, some months before the end, when Bruce had been quieter than usual. Not distressed, not visibly unwell, but quieter. According to this account, there was a moment when Bruce paused before getting out of the car and made a quiet comment, described only in general terms by the source, about things being in order. Not a dramatic statement, not a farewell, just a quiet acknowledgement that he had been thinking about arrangements. That kind of comment, made to a driver rather than to a family member, is not unusual for people of a certain generation. They often find it easier to speak plainly to someone outside the family circle, someone who will not be frightened by the words, someone who does not need to be protected from the reality of aging. But it also means that a significant piece of information, the fact that Bruce was thinking about arrangements, that he was in a particular frame of mind, may have been held by someone peripheral rather than someone central. Did the driver tell anyone? Did anyone ask? Was there a moment when that quiet comment in the car could have prompted a conversation that would have given his children a clearer picture of where their father's mind was in those final months? We do not know. That is the honest answer. We do not know what was communicated, what was withheld, what was forgotten, and what was simply never understood to be important until it was too late to ask. But the not knowing is itself a form of evidence, not evidence of wrongdoing, evidence of the gap between a public life and a private one, between the people who witnessed the performance and the people who needed to understand the man. In the entertainment world, there is a phrase that working actors use about the difference between being seen and being known. Being seen is what happens under the lights. Being known is what happens in the dark. Bruce was seen by hundreds of thousands of people across his career. The question of how many people truly knew him, and whether those people were the ones who most needed to speak after he was gone, is one that his children may still be living with. The domestic archive, then, is not only a collection of objects and memories. It is a collection of conversations that either happened or did not. A collection of explanations that were either given or withheld. A collection of moments when someone could have said, "Here is what I know. Here is what I saw. Here is what he told me," and either did or did not. For a family trying to understand the final 96 hours, every one of those moments matters. Every one of those conversations, or silences, is part of the inheritance. And the inheritance of silence is the hardest kind to accept, because it cannot be spent, cannot be displayed, and cannot be explained to the next generation without first being understood by this one. If someone who drove Bruce, or worked alongside him, or sat with him in a quiet room in his final months, is still holding a piece of the picture that his children have not seen, what would it cost now to simply hand it over? There is a place that exists in the biography of almost every long-serving performer, a place that is not on any map of their public career, not mentioned in any interview, not visible in any photograph taken for publication. It is the place where the performance stops entirely. Not the dressing room, which still belongs to the professional world. Not the green room, which is still a theater space, but the place beyond all of that. The private geography of a life that was never meant to be watched. For Bruce Allpress, that private geography included a particular kind of retreat that those who knew him in his later years described with careful vagueness. Not a second home in any dramatic sense, not a hidden address with a scandalous purpose, but a space, or a set of spaces, where he could exist without the weight of being recognized, without the obligation to be the person the public had decided he was. This is not unusual for performers of his generation. The pressure of a long public career creates a need for genuine privacy that is different from the performed privacy of celebrities who announce their desire for solitude while remaining entirely visible. Bruce's privacy was quieter than that. It was the privacy of a man who had given a great deal of himself to his work and who understood, perhaps better than most, that what remained of the self after the work was done needed to be protected. But private spaces can also become places where the full picture of a person's life is kept away from those who need it. Not through any dramatic design, but simply through the logic of separation. What happens in the private space stays in the private space. The people who share it are bound by an informal code of discretion. And when the person at the center of that space is gone, the code can outlast its usefulness. According to one account from someone who knew Bruce in his later years and who is asked not to be identified, there were aspects of his daily arrangements that were not widely discussed outside a small circle. Not a secret in the sensational sense, but a practical arrangement that shaped how his time was organized, who had access to him, and who was responsible for certain decisions about his daily life. This arrangement was known to some people in his professional circle and apparently not fully known to all members of his family. The nature of that arrangement is not something that can be stated as established fact in this account. What can be said is that the existence of any such arrangement, any structure that placed certain people in a position of practical authority over aspects of an older person's life, creates the conditions for exactly the kind of information gap that this story is about. When practical authority and family knowledge do not overlap completely, the result is a space where things can happen that the family does not immediately know about. Decisions can be made. Contacts can be managed. Information can be filtered, not necessarily with bad intent, but filtered nonetheless. And in the final weeks of a life, filtered information is the difference between a family that understands what happened and a family that is left to wonder. The private space, then, is not only a physical location, it is a structural reality. It is the gap between the life that was visible to the family and the life that was managed by others. And in that gap, the most important facts about a person's final days can become strangely difficult to recover. For Bruce's children, the question of what happened in that gap is not a question about scandal. It is a question about access. Did they have full access to the people who knew their father's practical arrangements? Did those people speak to them completely? Did the structure of his private life, whatever form it took, make it easier or harder for the family to receive a clear account after he was gone? These questions do not require a villain. They require only the acknowledgement that older people's lives are often managed by a combination of family and non-family figures, and that the handover of information between those two groups is rarely as smooth as it should be. The private space that Bruce maintained was, in the end, his right. Every person is entitled to a life that is not fully visible to others, including their children. But the right to privacy in life does not automatically extend to the right of others to maintain that privacy after death, especially when the people most affected by the death are still waiting for a complete account. If the private arrangements of Bruce Allpress' later life created a situation in which his children received less than the full picture of his final days, then the private space became something it was never meant to be. It became a barrier between a father and his family at the moment when that barrier was least acceptable. And if that barrier still exists in the form of information held by people who were present and have not yet spoken fully, then the private space is still doing its work long after the person it was meant to protect has gone. What would it mean for Bruce's legacy if the private spaces of his later life were finally made transparent to the people who loved him most? And is there anyone still holding a key to one of those spaces who has not yet decided whether to use it? For more than 2 years after the world had spoken its warm, careful farewell to Bruce Allpress, a woman who had spent considerable time inside his household during the final stretch of his life maintained a silence that was noticed only by a handful of people who knew she had something to say. She was not a figure from his public world. She had no credits in a film database, no profile in a theater program, no name attached to any of the press coverage that followed his passing. She was simply someone who had been present in a way that most people were not. Someone who had seen the daily machinery of his life from the inside, who had witnessed the texture of his ordinary hours in a period that has otherwise been described only in the smoothed and rounded language of public tribute. According to someone who was present when she finally spoke, in the months following his passing, her account, according to those who heard it, was not designed to wound. It was something more unsettling than dramatic revelation. It was specific, and it was calm, and it raised questions that some felt the public narrative had settled far too quickly. She described a man who remained sharp in conversation, but who had entered a period of fatigue that those around him had learned not to mention too directly. She described a household that operated through a combination of professional involvement and informal arrangement, with different people holding responsibility for different aspects of his day. She described a situation in which his family were in contact, genuinely and lovingly in contact, but not always, by her account, in full possession of the information that was quietly accumulating around his daily condition. And she described, in terms that her listener found difficult to set aside, a period in the final weeks when certain decisions appeared to have been made by the people who happened to be present, rather than by the people who might reasonably have expected to be consulted, or so she believed. None of this, she was careful to say, rose to the level of deliberate wrongdoing. She was not constructing an accusation. She was not positioning herself as the guardian of some suppressed truth. But she used a phrase, according to the person who heard her, that has not lost its edge in the time since. She said, or so the account goes, that his children should have been told certain things sooner. Not eventually, sooner. And in the context of a family working to understand the final days of a father who had been beloved and brilliant and then suddenly gone, the difference between sooner and eventually is not a gap that sentiment can fill. There had been, according to this account, a period in the weeks before the end when something changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but in the way that those who are paying close attention recognize as significant, even when those around them are choosing not to name it. His energy shifted. His patterns changed. The specific shape of his daily existence began to indicate something that the professionals in his immediate circle understood in practical terms, and the people close to him understood emotionally, but which apparently did not find its way to his children in the form of a direct, clear, timely conversation. The armor that a lifetime of performance had built around him, the habit of making strain look manageable, of presenting composure as his natural state, may have been working against him at exactly the moment when someone close enough to see through it needed to speak up. This is the failure that families describe most often and most quietly in situations like these. Not a dramatic act of concealment, not a villainous decision made for selfish reasons, but the accumulated effect of a dozen small decisions, each one made by someone who assumed the next person would fill the gap, each one reasonable in isolation and collectively ruinous. A care professional who assumed the family had been briefed on the medical side. A friend who assumed the family had been told about the practical arrangements. A neighbor who assumed someone else had already made the call. And the family, receiving fragments of reassurance from each direction, constructing from those fragments a picture that looked like the whole truth, and was in fact only a mosaic of its least alarming elements. The woman who spoke, according to this account, did not claim to have the complete picture herself. She was one observer among several, holding one perspective, one set of memories, one interpretation of what she had witnessed during that final period. But she believed, clearly and calmly, that what she knew was relevant to what the family deserved to understand. And she was troubled, in the way that decent people are troubled when they realize they may have waited too long. That the communication which should have happened through proper channels at the proper time had instead been left to the informal goodwill of people whose primary loyalty was not to the family's right to know, but to the easier logic of not creating difficulty. What would change if the person who held that original account chose to deliver it directly to the people who most needed it? And how many others, in Bruce Allpress's wider circle, are holding similarly specific knowledge behind a similarly unresolved decision about whether to speak? In the closing period of Bruce Allpress's life, a small number of people occupied a position that can only be understood as a collective, informal authority over the shape of his days. They were perhaps half a dozen, perhaps fewer, not a formal group with any acknowledged structure, not a committee with minutes and agendas on record, but a loose constellation of individuals who each contributed some element of support, presence, or oversight to the management of his existence. A care professional whose involvement had become more regular as his needs changed. A figure from his professional world whose friendship had outlasted the projects that created it. A neighbor whose proximity had gradually evolved into something closer to active involvement in his daily life. A person with some connection to his practical and financial affairs. Each of them knew Bruce in a different register, through a different history, with a different understanding of what they owed him and what he had needed from them. And none of them, this is the critical point, had any formal obligation to ensure that what they collectively knew was assembled and communicated fully to his family. This is how informal circles of care form around older public figures, and it happens without malice and without design. A practical matter arises that requires someone to be present, and the person available is not always a family member. A concern develops that needs to be addressed in the moment, and the person who addresses it assumes that someone else will follow up with the family. An observation accumulates over weeks that would be significant to the people who love the man most, but the person holding that observation never finds quite the right moment to pass it on. And then the moment that would have made it actionable passes, without the family ever knowing there was information to be requested. What distinguishes this kind of informal circle from a simple group of caring friends is the degree of access it collectively held. Access to his daily schedule. Access to his medical context. Access to the conversations he had when he was not performing the composed and contented version of himself that the world expected. Access, perhaps, to a picture of his final weeks that was more complete and more complicated than the version that reached his children through the channels that were open to them. Each member of the informal circle around Bruce carried a genuine connection to him. These were not strangers inserting themselves for personal advantage. They were people who had earned their proximity through real history, real care, real investment in his well-being across years that the family had not always been present to witness directly. But good intentions and complete information are not the same thing. A circle built entirely from people who mean well can still produce, through the logic of its own informal structure, a situation in which the family stands outside the ring of knowledge at the moment when they most need to be inside it. There is a dynamic that develops in these situations that deserves to be named carefully. Because each member of the circle holds only part of the picture, each one can sincerely believe that the part they hold is already known to the family. The care professional assumes the family has been updated on the medical side. The professional friend assumes the family knows about the practical arrangements. The neighbor assumes the family was told about what they observed. And the family, receiving reassurances from each of these directions, assumes that the fragments collectively constitute the full truth. They do not. They constitute the full truth minus all the parts that each member of the circle believed someone else had already communicated. For a man of Bruce's particular profile, the informal circle carried an additional weight that shaped its behavior in ways that may not have served his children well. His public life had created a category of loyalty in people who knew him through work, a loyalty that felt, to those who held it, like a form of protection. They had been witnesses to his talent and his discipline across decades of professional life. The idea of his vulnerability, his ordinary dependence on others at the end of a long life, being discussed openly, felt to some of them like a violation of the person they had respected. So they were discreet. They handled information about his final period with the care that they believed his stature deserved. And in doing so, they may have handled it away from the people who had the greatest right to hold it. There was a period, according to those familiar with his final months, when Bruce himself appeared to make a kind of effort, a late, quiet reaching toward the idea that things should be in order, that the people who mattered most should know what needed to be known. Those around him noticed it. It was not dramatic. It was the sort of thing that a person of his generation and his temperament would express through practical gesture rather than open declaration, a mention of certain arrangements, a comment about particular wishes, a quiet signal that he was thinking carefully about what came after. Whether those signals reached their intended destination is the question that his story refuses to let go. If you had known that a small group of people around someone you loved were holding a more complete picture of his final months than the one they shared with you, what would you want them to do with what they knew? In the period following the passing of Bruce Allpress, those responsible for gathering the formal record of his life discovered what families in this situation almost always discover. The official documents told one story, and the space between them told another. The formal instruments of a long life, the will with its legal designations, the property paperwork, the professional contracts from a career spanning more than half a century, constituted the visible architecture of his legacy. But visible architecture is never the whole building. It is only the part that was designed to be seen. Below the formal record, in any life lived as long and as fully as his, there exists another layer. The informal agreements made with people who managed aspects of his daily existence and who operated on the basis of verbal understanding rather than written document. The arrangements, if they can be called that, governing who would be contacted in a medical situation, who would speak on his behalf in a professional context, who held the information that a grieving family would need to answer its most urgent questions. These are the documents that do not exist as documents. They exist only in the memories of the people who were party to them. And when those people are left to decide, after a death, how much of their understanding to volunteer to a grieving family, the informal agreement becomes something else entirely. It becomes a decision about what the family is entitled to know. Those who have tried to piece together the practical arrangements of Bruce's final period describe a situation in which the formal record was broadly in order, but in which the informal record, the lived reality of how his days were organized, who held authority over what, and what had been communicated to whom and when, was considerably harder to establish. This is not unusual. It is, in fact, the norm for older people living with a combination of formal and informal support structures. But for a family trying to understand a final period, the difference between a clear, formal record and a murky, informal one is the difference between being able to trace the actual sequence of events and being left to reconstruct it from whatever fragments reach them through goodwill and imperfect memory. A specific document carries a different weight from a general one. Not the will, which is designed to survive scrutiny and be read by people who did not write it, but the smaller things, if they existed. A note left with a care professional about his preferences and concerns as his condition changed. An appointment record containing observations that no one thought to copy to the family. A message sent within the informal circle describing a development in his situation or a change in his understanding of where things stood. These small documents, none of them individually significant in a legal sense, form together a record of the final weeks that is often more truthful than the formal instruments, because they were created in the moment rather than in anticipation of being read later by people who were not there. The privacy rules governing medical records and care documentation mean that family members who were not formally designated as next of kin for particular aspects of care may find it genuinely difficult to access the informal documentary record of a loved one's final period. This is not a conspiracy. It is the ordinary operation of systems designed to protect patient privacy, and it serves important purposes. But it means that a family can be entirely loving, entirely present in spirit, and still find themselves unable to obtain the specific, practical, time-stamped account of what happened and when. They receive the summary, the clean version, the one translated into language suitable for a family in grief. They may never see the working notes beneath the summary. Bruce's professional history introduces another dimension to the documentation question that should not be overlooked. A career spanning more than half a century across radio, theater, television, and international cinema would have generated a considerable professional archive. Some of those instruments may have had implications extending well beyond his own lifetime. Rights arrangements, residual terms, conditions attached to particular professional relationships that continued to operate after he was gone. Whether his children had full knowledge and understanding of that professional archive, and whether anyone in the circle around him took responsibility for ensuring that they did, is a question this account cannot answer, and one that may have no troubling answer at all. But it belongs to the inheritance in the most literal sense of that word. Legacy is not only what is said at a memorial service, it is also what is signed, what is recorded, and in whose possession it sits when the person who created it is no longer available to explain it. There is one final category of documentation that deserves to be named directly, because it is the one families think about most and ask about least. It is the record that Bruce himself may have kept. Older performers carry within them a highly developed sense of what is worth preserving. Their entire professional lives have been built around the act of making moments last, of understanding which details matter and which will be forgotten. Whether he kept a diary, wrote letters, left notes for particular people, or recorded his thoughts in any form that survived him, only the people who cleared his home and handled his belongings after his death can say with certainty. And whether those people understood the significance of what they found and ensured that it reached his children rather than being filed or set aside or absorbed into the overwhelming logistics of grief, if any such record existed at all, that question carries the full weight of everything this story has been moving toward. If a document existed, even a brief one, even a single page, even a few lines written in Bruce's own familiar hand, describing what he hoped would happen and what he wanted the people who loved him most to understand, then the location of that document is not a minor administrative matter. It is the inheritance. It is the final chapter that his children were owed and may not yet have received in full, sitting somewhere in the gap between the public farewell that the world was given and the private truth that his family has been living with ever since. What is the one piece of documentation, written or unwritten, official or informal, that you believe would finally close the distance between the tribute Bruce Allpress received and the full account that his children still deserve? The question of what a person leaves behind has never been simple, and for those who loved Bruce Allpress not as an audience but as a father, the answer has always contained a room they could not fully enter. That room is not metaphorical. It is the accumulated space of everything that was known by others and not yet delivered to the people who had the greatest right to receive it. And the key to that room, if it exists at all, may still be in someone's pocket. There is a particular kind of evidence that does not announce itself. It does not arrive in a sealed envelope with a dramatic postmark. It sits in the ordinary places. A notebook left on a shelf, a voicemail saved without knowing why, a printed email folded into the back of a folder that nobody has opened since the week of the funeral. Those who worked alongside Bruce in the final years of his professional life understood that he was a man who paid attention to detail. He had spent a lifetime learning that the small things carry the scene. A glance, a pause, a word chosen over another word. He knew that what is left unsaid is often louder than what is spoken. And so the possibility that he left something, some record, some signal, some deliberate trace of his own understanding of where things stood, is not a romantic invention. It is, at least, entirely consistent with the man his colleagues describe. According to one person who was present in his household during the months before his passing, there was a period when Bruce appeared to be organizing. Not in the frantic way of someone who has received a sudden shock, but in the quiet, methodical way of someone who has been thinking carefully for some time and has decided that thinking is no longer sufficient. Papers were moved. Certain items were placed in a different order. A drawer that had been closed for a long time was opened and its contents examined. The person who witnessed this did not ask questions, because the code of the household was the same code that had governed his professional life. You do not interrupt the private preparation. But they noticed. And what they noticed was a man who was trying, in the language available to him, to make sure that the people who came after him would not be left entirely without a map. Whether that map survived the weeks that followed, whether it was found by the right hands, whether it was understood for what it was rather than filed away as part of the general administration of grief, these are the questions that the documentary record cannot answer, and that the informal circle around him has not yet answered publicly. The woman whose account was described in the previous period of this story, the one who said, with a calm that her listener found more disturbing than anger, that his children should have been told certain things sooner, was not speaking about a dramatic document. She was speaking about a pattern of information that moved through the wrong channels, at the wrong speed, filtered by people who believed they were being kind, and who may have been, in the most painful sense, mistaken about what kindness required. Kindness that withholds the truth is not kindness. It is a decision made on behalf of someone else about what they can bear. And the people who make that decision rarely have to live with its consequences the way the people they were protecting do. One could argue that the children of Bruce Allpress did not need to be protected from the facts of their father's final weeks, that they needed the plain sequence of what happened. That is not a demand for scandal. It is the minimum that love requires when it is trying to understand a loss. The professional archive question, which the previous section of this story raised and left open, carries a specific weight that deserves to be brought to its conclusion here. A career of more than 50 years across radio, theater, television, and international cinema does not simply end when the performer leaves the world. It continues to exist in the form of rights, residuals, licensing arrangements, and the ongoing commercial life of the work itself. The appearance in the great fantasy saga filmed on New Zealand soil, brief, memorable, noticed by fans across the world, did not cease to have value when Bruce ceased to be present to benefit from it. Whether his children understood the full extent of that ongoing value, whether they were given a complete account of the professional arrangements that governed it, and whether anyone in the circle around him took responsibility for ensuring that the transition of that knowledge was handled with the same care as the transition of his personal effects. These are questions worth asking, though no evidence of any failure has been established. There is a particular cruelty in the possibility that a man who gave his professional life to an industry might have left his children less informed about the ongoing value of that life than the industry itself. Not through any dramatic theft, not through any single act of concealment, but through the ordinary failure of communication that happens when the people who hold professional knowledge assume that someone else has handled the family side, and the people who hold family knowledge assume that someone else has handled the professional side. And the family stands in the middle, receiving neither account in full. If that is what happened, and it must be stated clearly that this account does not assert it as established fact, only as a possibility that the emotional and structural logic of the story makes impossible to ignore, then the inheritance Bruce Allpress left his children was diminished not by his choices, but by the choices of others, by the accumulated weight of small decisions made by people who were not the ones who would have to live with the consequences, by the silence that settled over the final days and the weeks surrounding them, a silence that was perhaps never intended to be permanent, but that has lasted long enough to become its own kind of answer. And that silence has a shape. It is not the shape of a single villain standing in a doorway with a locked box. It is the shape of a system, informal, well-meaning, and ultimately insufficient, that placed the management of a beloved man's final period in the hands of people who were not accountable to his children in any formal sense, and who may not have understood that accountability as a moral obligation, even when the formal one was absent. The antagonist in this story is not a person. It is the assumption that someone else will make the important call. It is the comfort of believing that the family has been told what they need to know, without ever checking whether that belief is true. Do you believe that the people closest to Bruce Allpress in his final months have said everything they know? And if not, what do you think is still waiting to be said? There are moments in the life of a long career when the body begins to speak more loudly than the professional will. The signals are not always dramatic. They do not always arrive as a crisis that demands immediate response. They arrive as a slight change in the quality of attention, a new carefulness in movement, a preference for sitting that was not there before, a tiredness that does not lift after a night's sleep. People who have spent their lives performing learn to manage these signals with extraordinary skill. They have been trained, by decades of showing up regardless of how they feel, to present a surface that does not betray the interior. And the people around them, trained by the same decades to accept that surface as the truth, often do not look beneath it until looking beneath it is no longer a choice. Those who were present with Bruce in the period that preceded his final weeks describe, in the careful language of people who are aware of what they are saying, a man who was managing. That word, managing, carries everything. It means he was not well in the way that a younger man is well. It means he was applying effort to the maintenance of his ordinary life that had not previously been required. It means that the gap between how he appeared and how he was had widened in ways that were visible to those who were paying close attention and invisible to those who were not. The medical dimension of this period is one that this account cannot enter with any precision, because the records that would give it precision are protected by the privacy rules that govern all medical information, and because the family's own understanding of that dimension is part of what this story is about. What can be said is that the people who held professional responsibility for his care during this period were operating within a system that was not designed to ensure that family members received a complete and timely account of what that care involved. The system was designed to protect the patient. It was not designed to protect the family's right to know. And in the gap between those two purposes, information can accumulate that a family only discovers it needed after the moment when it could have changed something has already passed. There is a specific kind of medical conversation that older patients often have with their care professionals that their families never hear. Not because it is hidden from them deliberately, but because the patient has the right to determine what is shared and with whom. And because older people of a particular generation often exercise that right in the direction of protection rather than disclosure. They do not want to worry their children. They do not want to be seen as diminished. They do not want the conversation about their health to become the only conversation, crowding out the ordinary warmth of family contact with the clinical weight of prognosis and management. So they manage the information themselves, deciding what to share and what to carry alone. And the care professionals who serve them respect that decision because it is the patient's right to make it. But when the patient is gone, the information they chose to carry alone does not automatically transfer to the family. It remains with the care professionals, protected by the same privacy rules that protected it during the patient's lifetime, accessible only through formal processes that a grieving family may not know to initiate, or may not have the standing to pursue, or may simply not have the emotional capacity to navigate in the weeks immediately following a loss. And so, the medical picture of a person's final period, the actual clinical account of what was happening, what was known, what was being managed, and what the trajectory looked like to the people who were monitoring it, can remain effectively inaccessible to the family long after the public farewell has been delivered and the sympathy cards have stopped arriving. For Bruce's children, the medical dimension of his final weeks is not a matter of morbid curiosity. It is a matter of understanding. Understanding what their father experienced. Understanding whether the care he received was appropriate to what was actually happening. Understanding whether there were moments when a different decision, a different call, a different conversation, a different level of urgency might have changed the shape of those final days. These are not questions that require a scandal to justify them. They are the questions that any child asks when a parent is gone, and the account they have received feels incomplete. The care professionals involved in Bruce's final period have not given a public account of what that period involved, which is entirely as it should be. But the question of whether they gave a complete private account to his family, whether they sat with his children and walked them through the sequence of what happened, what was known, what was done, and what the final weeks actually looked like from the inside of the care relationship, is a question that the family's experience of the aftermath suggests may not have a fully satisfying answer. The armor that Bruce wore through a lifetime of professional performance may have been, in the end, the thing that made it hardest for the people who loved him to understand what he needed. He had spent 50 years making strain look manageable. He had trained everyone around him to accept his composed surface as the truth. And in the final period, when the strain was no longer entirely manageable, the people who might have spoken up, who might have said to his children, directly and plainly, that things were more serious than they appeared, may have been held back by the same respect for his composure that had governed their relationship with him for decades. They did not want to betray his performance. They did not want to be the ones who said out loud what he had chosen not to say. And in that loyalty, however genuine, they may have left his children without the information they needed to be fully present in the time that remained. If you had been in the room during those final weeks, and you had seen what the care professionals saw, what would you have felt obligated to tell his children? And would you have found the courage to say it? The world that Bruce Allpress left behind when his path came to its end was not the world he had entered when his career began. The New Zealand entertainment industry of his early years was a small, intimate, sometimes struggling enterprise that asked its performers to be versatile, patient, and willing to work without the infrastructure that larger industries took for granted. By the time he left it, that industry had been transformed by the arrival of international production, by the global recognition that came with the fantasy saga filmed on home soil, by the digital preservation of work that would otherwise have faded from memory. His face, which had once been known only to the audiences of a small nation, had become part of a global archive. His voice, which had learned its craft in radio studios that no longer exist, had been heard by people on every continent. That transformation is part of his legacy, and it is a remarkable one. But legacy is not only what the world inherits, it is also what the family inherits. And the family's inheritance, in the most complete sense of that word, includes not only the pride and the affection and the professional achievement, but also the full account of the man behind the achievement. The private person, the father, the individual who navigated the ordinary vulnerabilities of age and illness and the end of a long life with the same quiet dignity that had characterized everything else he did. The people who were present in Bruce's final period, the informal circle, the care professionals, the household figures, the professional contacts who remained close, each hold a piece of that account. Each of them witnessed something that his children did not witness directly. Each of them carries a memory, a detail, a specific moment from the final weeks that belongs, in the most fundamental moral sense, to the family. Not to the public, not to the archive, not to the industry that celebrated him. To his children. The question of whether those pieces have been fully delivered, whether the people who hold them have understood their obligation to pass them on, and whether they have acted on that understanding, is the question that this story has been building toward from its first moment. It is not a question about scandal. It is not a question about wrongdoing in any legal sense. It is a question about the most basic form of respect that can be shown to a family in grief. The willingness to tell them what you know, completely and without the filter of what you think they can bear, so that they can understand the full shape of the life they are mourning. Bruce Allpress gave his professional life to the act of making other people's stories feel real. He inhabited characters written by others and made them live. He brought to every role the discipline of a craftsman and the humanity of a man who had paid attention to the world around him for more than 8 decades. He deserved, at the end of that life, to have his own story told completely to the people who loved him most. Not the public story, which has been told with warmth and care and genuine affection. The private story. The final chapter. The account of the last days that his children have been trying to assemble from fragments ever since the world said its farewell and moved on. If that account has not yet been delivered in full, then the people who hold the remaining pieces are still making a choice. Every day that passes without those pieces being placed in the right hands is another day in which the inheritance is incomplete. Another day in which the children of a respected and beloved man are living with a question that someone else has the power to answer. The silence that settled over Bruce Allpress's final days was not, in all likelihood, the silence of malice. It was the silence of people who were overwhelmed, or uncertain, or protective, or simply unaware of how much their particular piece of the picture mattered to the people who needed the whole. But silence, however it begins, becomes its own kind of statement when it continues long enough. It becomes the statement that the family's right to know is less important than the comfort of not having to speak. That statement is wrong. It has always been wrong, and the people who can correct it know who they are. What would it mean to you if you were one of Bruce's children to finally receive the complete account, not the public tribute, Not the polished remembrance, but the plain, honest, full record of your father's last days. And is there anyone watching this who was present in that final period and has not yet found the courage to make that call? Friends, we want to hear from you directly. How do you feel about Bruce Allpress? Was he a man let down by the system around him? Or do you believe the people closest to him did everything they could? Was he a victim of the silence that so often surrounds older performers at the end of their lives? Or did he choose that silence for himself? Write your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and we genuinely want to know whether Bruce is remembered in your city, in your home, in the stories your family tells. If this story moved you, if it raised questions you've been carrying yourself about someone you loved and lost, then like this video for the truth it is trying to tell, and subscribe so that the next chapter of stories like this one reaches you when it arrives. Bruce Allpress gave the world more than 50 years of honest, disciplined, deeply human work. The least the world can give his children is the conversation that should have happened sooner.